Hey everyone, this is Will, and welcome to this brand new and exciting episode of The Missing Piece. More than 6 months later, as the world continues to pay attention to the war in Ukraine, and lately there has been a lot of positive reports regarding how the Ukrainian government is implementing much greater strategies to tackle the opponents and especially the enemies within the Russian side. But meanwhile, that if you take a look at closely around the international community, that one of the largest countries in the world seem to generating more noises today, which is China. However, in this episode, again, as we mentioned before, it's not just about the war in Ukraine, it's more about the position that China takes. But meanwhile, according to the recent article, that China's reaction and also recently China's economic prosperity, it's actually creating much more criticism, not only from some of the enemies in Asia, but also some of the heavy critics in the Middle East. So that's why today we need to dive into the issues and really discuss the matters behind this country. Now, ladies and gentlemen, join our show today is Mr. Lucas Weber. Now, Lucas Weber, it's an analyst of geopolitics and violent non-state actors, as well as the co-founder and editor of Militant Wire. Lucas, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having me on, Will. I appreciate it.
No problem, Lucas. The pleasure's all mine. Again, first of all, I want to say, when I get on the website called a Militant Wire, that was a very insightful and also very informative. Now, I want to get to the questions based on one article that recently you published, which is entitled ISKP publishes its most comprehensive critique of China, yet threatens war with Beijing and sees opportunity in World War III. Now, Lucas, help us understand. Now, it's on one hand, it's interesting that we're discussing the war between Russia and Ukraine at this moment, but meanwhile, that Beijing administration, on the surface, we know is facing a lot more criticism because this political disentanglement with the U.S. and also this economic prosperity. But meanwhile, help us to understand, why is ISKP having problems with China's solution or China's growth? What is the story actually behind the title?
Well, ISKP has, I'll give some background briefly. It was formed in 2014, 2015 in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region. And since its founding, which was inspired by the rise of the caliphate in the Middle East, it has been fairly hostile to the great powers, China, Russia, the U.S., and a number of other smaller powers. And for years, criticism of China based on its domestic policies against Uyghurs and its foreign policies, its perceived support for Assad. The criticism of China from the Islamic State came from its Middle Eastern elements. But since the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan, the Taliban has become ISKP, which is the Afghanistan-Pakistan branch of the Islamic State, its number one enemy. And therefore it has not only been waging a guerrilla warfare campaign against the Taliban, but also a media warfare campaign against them as well. And this media warfare campaign involves narratives designed to discredit the Taliban and to undermine its legitimacy as a governing body and a religious authority. So one of the main ways it has gone about this has been to criticize the Taliban's relations with foreign governments, especially ones that are perceived by the Islamic State as being enemies of Muslims or are perceived as waging a war on Islam. So ISKP has zeroed in on the Taliban's relations with the U.S., with Russia, and with China. And when it comes to China, it has essentially accused the Taliban of being a proxy of Beijing and protecting its interests in exchange for foreign aid and hopefully foreign investment.
Well, Lucas, in reality, again, as much as we know, of course, that I'm sure you're mindful as well, that Chinese government is very much interested in the country of Afghanistan, especially when sitting U.S. President Joe Biden decided to pull the troops out of the country. Again, on one hand, people live under Taliban. It's living is unimaginably painful situations every day. But meanwhile, China is tending to taking advantage of the country in terms of resources, in terms of this friendship. Now, again, help us to understand why is that offensive to this Islamic State or what we call the terrorist groups. So in other words, what is the motivation for them to really criticize China? Is it just because the Chinese economic prosperity, or is it because this modernity, which is close to what U.S. is doing, which is considered the capitalistic system?
Well, essentially, the Taliban, as ISKP's primary enemy, is struggling in its governance at the moment. So it faces a dire humanitarian crisis and very deep economic troubles. So naturally, with China being the economic powerhouse in the region, the Taliban is looking to China for both foreign aid and foreign investment. And in the mind of the Islamic State, anything that strengthens or could strengthen the Taliban's position is something that they are going to look to disrupt. So by launching attacks or threatening attacks on Chinese interests and becoming very bellicose towards China, they want to create a chill effect for Chinese companies that may want to invest in Afghanistan or any kind of Chinese-backed infrastructure programs in the country, or even ISKP has explicitly put out threatened aid workers. So, and it mentioned China giving the Taliban aid. So it says any aid workers that help the Taliban will be a target of us. So they're really trying to play a spoiler role and undermine the Taliban's relations with China. And so that's on the Taliban's end, or on ISKP's framing of the Taliban. And it also has hostilities towards China because it views China as correctly as a rising power. It talks about the end of the unipolar era, as there are multiple great powers in the international system now, and it now thinks that it's not only going to be the U.S. and Russia that are its primary international enemies, but now with China's expanded global influence and footprint, not only in South and Central Asia, but in Africa as well, it is going to inevitably lead to conflict between the Islamic State and China.
Well, but Lucas, in reality, again, just follow your thoughts. One thing that we cannot deny is China is such an ambitious country. Not only given the fact that this country today is in this deadlock position with the U.S. in terms of economic competition and political decoupling with the U.S. But meanwhile, I want to go back to the article. That's something that you wrote quite outstanding, which it says, ISKP says Beijing is moving quickly to build its political, economic, and military power to counter the West and exert its influence internationally. Now, Lucas, in reality, don't you think this is the right strategy for China to do in order to secure this position among the international community? So, in other words, if we are seeing that China is on the rise, or Chinese economy is growing, that could actually be beneficial to the country of Afghanistan. But why is ISKP having problem with it? So in other words, if they're embedded within this country, if Afghanistan is getting richer, don't you think that ISKP is getting some benefits at the same time? So what is the problem with it?
Well, I see Chinese foreign policy and its exercise of influence and countering the U.S., for instance. I think this is just the nature of great power competition, which is surging. And there's a saying kind of, when elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. And that is the Islamic State's kind of approach, where they say that these big powers that are going to be locking horns, they're going to be taking advantage of Muslim countries and oppressing Muslim peoples in order to leverage these countries in competition with each other. And as far as China's economic growth potentially helping Afghanistan, they actually see that as a problem, because that strengthens the Taliban's hold on power, and the Taliban would like the Islamic State would like the Taliban to remain weak and to have discontent amongst the population grow against the new Taliban government. Any kind of strengthened Taliban government would mean a strengthened Taliban military and counterterrorism force. So the Islamic State is looking to disrupt this. It's not. They don't have the good of the people in mind. It's their position against the Taliban, and they'd rather have a weak Taliban than an improving and stronger Taliban.
So in other words, Lucas, again, correct me if I'm wrong. So you're saying the Taliban and the ISKP are in this competitive situation, or in this competitive mood. So in other words, the weaker the Taliban is, the much stronger the ISKP could become. So in other words, help us understand, again, when I was reading this article, it was very insightful, but meanwhile, it seems very puzzling to understand what is the ultimate relationship between the Taliban government and the ISKP at this moment. Because generally we believe, if this is an Islamic State that live under Taliban, so again, as we mentioned before, if the country is getting richer or its country is getting wealthier, everyone has to share. But it doesn't seem to be that way, and also seem very resentful towards any economic prosperity or any economic support for any larger economies. Help us understand, how should we understand this relationship between the Taliban and the ISKP at this moment?
They are direct and primary enemies of each other, and they are waging a brutal war against each other. And ISKP was under some pressure when there was external counterterrorism operations going on against them, air campaigns by the United States and the like. And when the U.S. left, and the Taliban took over, we start to see how limited the Taliban's counterterrorism and counterinsurgency capabilities were. And ISKP was able to take advantage of this, and the attacks have surged, and they've been able to strike repeatedly inside the capital. And this is an embarrassment to the Taliban, because it's they want to be seen as a credible government, a capable government by the international community, but they can't even control or secure its own capital city. And this is part of the Islamic State's strategy. They want to undermine international confidence, China's confidence, and with the Russian attack, Russia's confidence in the Taliban's ability to provide security. And with this, becomes a chill effect, and countries that want to invest in Afghanistan, help with the development of Afghanistan, and work with the Taliban, this gives them cause for concern. And that is the strategy of ISKP.
Again, we know that this year, 2022, it's very crucial for many reasons, particularly related to China. Now, within the article, again, Lucas, you also touch on that what we called China's Belt and Road Initiative, also known as BRI. And you mentioned that this BRI project offers a lucrative loan scheme for the developing countries. And of course, that Chinese government sent numerous delegates and higher officials to the country of Afghanistan, also across the continent, continue to develop such projects. So again, some experts might argue that the purpose behind BRI, it's really to inject or insert the Chinese influence. But on the other hand, according to the article, that ISKP seems so worried about the influence of Belt and Road Initiative. Again, going back to this economic factor, China is growing rapidly, but some of the countries are actually suffering due to economic crisis. How much do you think that ISKP can actually interfere China's Belt and Road Initiative in Afghanistan? And if so, what will be some of the necessary measures they could take in order to avoid China's growth?
I think that you can already see how cautious Beijing has been, because they've held numerous talks, frequent talks with the Taliban, and they're taking a very practical approach. They essentially accept the Taliban is in power, and this is a reality, whether we like it or not. So we have to work with them. There's no other choice, and this will be this way for the foreseeable future. So there's also been talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative being extended into Afghanistan, or else Afghanistan becoming part of the China-Pakistan economic corridor somehow, which is a kind of wing of the BRI. And however, I think China is being very cautious because, as we've previously mentioned, their decision makers, their policy makers, their intelligence apparatus, they're very attuned to what's going on and to the publications that the Islamic State is putting out, the attacks they're launching on international targets, such as they reportedly plotted an attack against the Turkmenistan embassy in 2021, and they just hit the Russian embassy on September 5th. And they have said also that they're going to hit business targets, infrastructure development targets, foreign nationals, foreign aid workers. So I think they're actually having success in creating this chill effect, and China is behaving accordingly and approaching the Taliban practically, but very, very cautious in what they're actually doing on the ground.
But Lucas, in reality, we know that due to the war in Ukraine, Russia and China actually grow much closer. Given the fact that two leaders, President Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, they built not only this diplomatic, but to some extent, again, you might argue with me, but we believe it's a personal relationship. So with that said, if both Russia and China pose as threat to ISKP, in reality, the question people are saying is, or people asking is, how could one organization, ISKP, can minimize this influence for both countries? Remember, America is terrified by both countries at this moment for multiple or various purposes, reasons. So how would you think that ISKP can actually use such bombing or such terrorism-related attacks could actually minimize the position of Russia and China at the same time, given the fact that U.S. is continuing figuring out the solution, how to counter China, how to counter the influence of Russia at the same time. What is your reaction, Lucas?
Well, when we look at the intensifying great power competition between U.S. and Russia and U.S. and China, and how U.S. foreign policy is pushing the two, well, seems to be pushing the two closer together. The thing is, the U.S. has to do so globally. They have to counter the influence of these two powers globally, whereas the Islamic State, they only have to do it in the regions that they're active in. And ISKP has taken the lead. They're the most hawkish anti-China and maybe not anti-Russia, but they're very anti-Russia branch of the whole global Islamic State network. And so they look to, they're aiming, they have limited objectives in these regions, even though they talk really big. So what they want to do is they just want to prevent investment. They want to prevent diplomacy. The Islamic State published a editorial in their latest newsletter, and they spoke of how embassies and consulates, which are at the core of local and regional diplomacy for China and Russia, how it's necessary to target these, how they've targeted these in the past, and how they must continue targeting these because they call them spy dens, and they say that intelligence operations and drone strike operations are planned in these embassies. So they're really starting with limited objectives, limited targeting priorities, and they want to hit high value targets that have big symbolism, are great for morale in the region and recruitment, and also undermine the Taliban and make them look very incompetent to international powers.
Now, Lucas, despite everything you said, but in reality, again, you're the expert. When U.S. withdrew their troops from Afghanistan, this country was left in turmoil. And everyone within the country is pretty much terrified after Taliban took over. Now, China has been very generous in supporting the country, despite meeting with the Taliban leaders and, countering this war ideology or whatever you want to say it. But in reality, stability matters the most for the country. So our next question is, follow your thought. If ISKP is trying to minimize the influence of the current Taliban government and also trying to decouple with the Chinese economy or with the Russia support, whatever the resources that they are now satisfied, at the end of the day, if the country actually shrinks or continue to go down, how does that even benefit ISKP in the long run? So in other words, they can't run this country based on their terrorist mindset to rule the people. You have to have some sort of structural or organizational or even governmental system in order to push the country forward. How would you justify that?
Well, what the Islamic State would like to do is they'd like to continue undermining the Taliban, and they'd like to keep them weak. And what they are doing is they're working on their own timeline. They're not working on our timeline or China's timeline or the Taliban's timeline or Russia's timeline. They have their own timeline, and they've proven very patient. And what I suspect is they have held territory in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region before. They've given that strategy up for the foreseeable future in order to wage guerrilla warfare and urban terrorism operations in a cohesive campaign. So basically, I think what they're doing is they're waiting for some kind of crisis, because it's unclear if the current trajectory of the Taliban's governance, given the dire humanitarian crisis and the deep economic troubles they're facing, is sustainable. Maybe you'll see factionalism break out between the Taliban. Maybe you'll see resistance groups like the National Resistance Front kind of carve out a piece of Afghanistan. Maybe you'll see some neighboring country that keeps getting hit by ISKP and has to send their military in order to protect their borders, create chaos. So they're kind of sticking to their current plan of terrorism and insurgency, making it painful for the Taliban, trying to keep them weak as much as they are capable of. And then if chaos breaks out, they can exploit this, and maybe this means governing a small region at first and growing from there, as we've seen in Africa and in the Middle East. So it's hard to know what their internal communications are, but this is the impression that I get.
Lucas, I know you're very busy. Stay with me. I got 2 more questions before letting you go. Now, we know that Afghanistan is full of rich resources. I mean, that could be one of the reasons why Chinese government taps into this country. Think about the natural resources and think about the human resources. Now, how do you think that China is going to respond if ISKP right now is in conflict with the Taliban government? So in other words, every single country is interested in expanding or reaching out to other neighboring countries, given the fact that we need to work together for the much greater purposes. But if ISKP continues to be a hurdle or obstacle for China, for Russia, how do you think that the countries such as China, such as Russia, react to this ISKP? Do you think, again, we mentioned this growing military power in China. We talk about this economic influence from China and also from the Russia side. Can we imagine there's a partnership between China and Russia and joined together by using military force or any type of force could take out ISKP in order to restore the stability of Afghanistan under the Taliban government? How likely is it going to happen?
I believe Russia is fighting on too many fronts at the moment. For instance, the Russian government-linked Wagner group is very busy in Africa with jihadists. They're bogged down in a war in Ukraine. And I think that they're being attacked in Afghanistan. I think that what we could see is China and Russia increasing their security support, perhaps quietly behind the scenes, to strengthen the Taliban's counterterrorism capabilities. Because we have to remember, China has the Islamic State has the Islamic State Khorasan province is active in Pakistan as well, where China has the China-Pakistan economic corridor and lots of business projects and its foreign nationals there. And in Central Asia is the same. And a pro-ISKP group, an Uzbek group, actually just put out a statement saying that as ISKP infiltrates Central Asia, they're going to focus on attacking China's pipelines that run through Central Asia into China, and they're going to place a priority on this. So I think China is, although it would be very hard for ISKP to hit China itself due to geographical boundaries and a very strong border security. I think they're worried about their interests being hit in Central and South Asia and inside Afghanistan. And this is all stemming essentially from Afghanistan, as ISKP is an Afghan-centric organization. So the most logical thing that I could see is China helping, perhaps through Pakistan or some other way, helping build up the Taliban's counterterrorism and counterinsurgency capabilities.